Good evening. Let us look more carefully at what is happening here tonight, because what you are about to hear is not another update about trenches in Donbass or missile strikes on energy infrastructure. What we are witnessing in these past 72 hours represents something far more significant than a tactical adjustment. Ukraine has opened a new front, and the Russian military response tells us more about the structural weakness of Moscow's position than 6 months of Western intelligence briefings ever could. Most people are watching the headlines, most people are seeing drone footage and troop movements, but very few are asking the question that matters. Why now? Why there? And what does this reveal about the hidden architecture of this war that neither side wants you to fully understand? Let me be direct with you. If you believe this new front is simply about capturing territory or creating a bargaining chip for future negotiations, you are looking at the chessboard but missing the game. The real story here is not about land, it is about logistics, strategic depth, and the slow unraveling of Russia's ability to sustain a multi-axis conflict with finite reserves. What Ukraine has done in the past week is not desperate. It is calculated. And Moscow's scrambling response is not temporary chaos. It is symptomatic of a force that has been stretched beyond its operational breaking point for longer than most analysts are willing to admit publicly. Tonight, I want to show you exactly what is happening beneath the surface of this development. I want to walk you through the structural logic that makes this new front not just tactically bold, but strategically devastating for Russia's long-term position. And I want to explain why this moment right now in April 2026 may be remembered as the inflection point where Moscow's narrative of controlled escalation finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. So let us begin by understanding what everyone else is getting wrong about the situation. The mainstream interpretation goes something like this. Ukraine, facing pressure in the east, has decided to open a second or third front to relieve that pressure by forcing Russia to redeploy forces. That interpretation is not incorrect. It is incomplete. It treats this move as reactive, when in fact it is the culmination of 18 months of systematic preparation. You do not open a new front with battalion-strength forces. You open it with the infrastructure to sustain operations, the intelligence to exploit gaps, and the strategic patience to wait until your adversary is locked into commitments they cannot easily reverse. Ukraine did not stumble into this opportunity. Ukraine engineered it. Look at the timing, spring 2026. Russian forces have spent the winter consolidating positions in the east, absorbing casualties, rotating exhausted units, and trying to maintain defensive coherence across a front that now stretches over 1,000 kilometers. Moscow has committed reserves to holding Donetsk, to pressuring Zaporizhzhia, to defending Crimea's land bridge. Those commitments are not flexible. They are fixed. Every brigade holding a trench line in the east is a brigade that cannot rapidly redeploy without creating a vacuum. And Ukraine knows this because Ukraine has spent 2 years learning how Russian command structures actually function under stress, not how they are supposed to function according to doctrine. Now here is where you need to subscribe, because what I am about to show you is the kind of layered analysis you will not find in 15-second news clips or think tank summaries written for policymakers who already made up their minds. If you want to understand the real mechanics of how modern wars are won and lost, if you want to see the hidden systems underneath the visible battles, subscribe now for ongoing analysis that treats you like an intelligent adult, not a passive consumer of propaganda. Let us continue. The new front is not random geography. It is chosen for maximum operational disruption with minimum force commitment. Ukraine has identified a section of the line where Russian defenses are thinly held, where logistics routes are exposed, where the terrain favors mobility over static defense, and where Moscow cannot reinforce without pulling units from politically sensitive positions. This is not opportunism. This is systems analysis applied to warfare. Ukraine looked at the map not as territory, but as a network of dependencies, vulnerabilities, and choke points. They found the node where pressure creates cascading failures, and they struck it. Russian forces are now scrambling to react, and that scrambling reveals 3 critical truths about Moscow's position that you need to understand clearly. First, Russia no longer has a strategic reserve capable of responding to multiple simultaneous crises without cannibalizing forces from existing commitments. The units being rushed to this new front are not fresh divisions held in readiness. They are battalions pulled from other sectors, leaving gaps that Ukraine can exploit elsewhere. This is the definition of strategic overstretched. You cannot defend everywhere when your adversary chooses when and where to attack. Second, the speed and quality of Russia's response shows a breakdown in unified command. Different military districts are moving at different speeds. Coordination between ground forces and air support is visibly fragmented. Orders are being issued, countermanded, and revised in real time because Moscow does not have a pre-existing plan for this contingency. That should alarm anyone who understands military effectiveness. Competent general staffs war game scenarios. Incompetent ones react with improvisation. What we are seeing is improvisation disguised as adaptation. Third, and this is perhaps the most telling detail, Russia is moving forces by rail and road in ways that suggest they are more concerned with political optics than operational efficiency. Units are being rushed forward not because they are the best troops for the job, but because their deployment sends a signal of strength to domestic audiences and international observers. This is theater masquerading as strategy, and theater does not win wars. Logistics, morale, intelligence, and sustainable force generation win wars. Russia is failing on all four fronts simultaneously. Let us go deeper into the structural layers here, because this is where the real lesson lives. The first layer is manpower. Russia began this war with a certain number of contract soldiers, mobilized reservists, and whatever Wagner and other irregular forces could provide. 2 years in, casualty rates have eroded that pool significantly. Replacements are either untrained conscripts, older reservists with limited combat value, or foreign recruits whose loyalty and effectiveness are questionable. Ukraine, by contrast, has been rotating forces systematically, training brigades in Western combined arms tactics, and maintaining a reserve capacity that allows for offensive operations like this new front. The manpower calculus has shifted. Russia is burning through personnel faster than it can regenerate competent units. The second layer is equipment. Early in the war, Russia had a quantitative advantage in tanks, artillery, and armored vehicles. Much of that advantage has been destroyed or degraded. Stocks of Soviet-era equipment are being pulled from deep storage, refurbished poorly, and sent to the front where they break down or get destroyed within weeks. Meanwhile, Ukraine is receiving increasingly sophisticated Western systems, longer-range artillery, better air defense, precision strike capabilities, and electronic warfare tools that degrade Russian command and control. The equipment gap is closing, and in some categories, reversing. The third layer is logistics. Russia's logistical system was never designed for a sustained high-intensity conflict at this scale and distance from its railheads. Ammunition consumption rates are staggering. Fuel, food, medical supplies, spare parts, all of these must flow continuously to keep units operational. Ukraine has systematically targeted Russian logistics nodes, rail junctions, ammunition depots, and fuel storage facilities. Every successful strike compounds the problem. And now, with a new front open, Russia must stretch those same fragile logistics networks even thinner. You cannot resupply two fronts with the capacity for 1.5. The fourth layer is command and control. Russian military doctrine relies heavily on centralized decision-making. Junior officers have limited initiative. Decisions flow up the chain, approvals flow back down, and the entire system depends on clear communication and unified command. Ukraine has disrupted that system relentlessly through electronic warfare, targeted strikes on command posts, and exploitation of Russian communication vulnerabilities. The result is a force that reacts slowly, adapts poorly, and makes mistakes that get people killed unnecessarily. When you see Russian units scrambling to respond to Ukraine's new front, you are not seeing agility. You are seeing confusion papered over with urgency. The fifth layer is morale and political cohesion. Russian soldiers are increasingly aware that they are fighting a war their leadership has misrepresented, that casualties are higher than official figures admit, and that the promised quick victory has turned into an indefinite grind. Desertions are rising. Discipline is breaking down in some units. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces are defending their homeland with the kind of motivation that cannot be manufactured through propaganda. That asymmetry matters. It matters in how units perform under fire, how they hold positions under pressure, and how they execute complex operations like opening a new front when the strategic moment arrives. The sixth layer, and this is critical, is international support sustainability. Russia is increasingly isolated from Western technology, from global financial systems, and from the kind of economic integration that allows modern states to sustain prolonged conflicts. Sanctions are biting deeper than Moscow admits. China and India are buying Russian oil at discounts, but they are not providing the kind of military-industrial support that would allow Russia to regenerate its forces at the rate Ukraine is being supported by NATO. This is a war of attrition, not just on the battlefield, but in the factories, the supply chains, and the economic systems that underpin military power. Russia is losing that war slowly but unmistakably. Now let us pull the lens back and ask the historical question. Where have we seen this pattern before? A large military power invades a smaller neighbor expecting quick victory, gets bogged down in unexpectedly fierce resistance, overextends its logistics and command structures, and then faces the nightmare scenario of fighting on multiple fronts with finite resources. The answer is the Soviet Union in Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989. The parallels are not perfect, but they are instructive. In Afghanistan, the Soviets controlled the cities and the roads during the day. The Mujahideen controlled the mountains and the countryside at night. The Soviets could win every tactical engagement and still lose the war because they could not sustain the political, economic, and human cost of indefinite occupation. They withdrew not because they were defeated in battle, but because the structural logic of the conflict became unsustainable. Russia in Ukraine is facing a variation of that same logic. They can hold territory, they can inflict casualties, they can launch missiles and call it strategy, but they cannot force Ukraine to accept a political settlement that legitimizes Russian control over occupied territories. They cannot prevent Western support from flowing, and they cannot solve the fundamental problem that their force is too small to occupy Ukraine and too weak to destroy Ukrainian resistance entirely. The opening of this new front exposes that contradiction in the starkest possible terms. If Russia moves forces to defend the new front, they weaken the East. If they hold in the East, the new front expands. There is no good option. There are only trade-offs between bad outcomes. History also shows us the pattern of empires overestimating their strength and underestimating their adversaries' resilience. Napoleon in Russia, the United States in Vietnam, the British in Afghanistan. These are not perfect analogs, but they share a common theme. The aggressor assumes that superior firepower and initial momentum will break the defender's will, and when that assumption proves false, the aggressor is left fighting a war they cannot win because winning requires resources, political will, and strategic flexibility they do not possess. Russia made that assumption in February 2022. 2 years later, Ukraine is not broken. It is adapting, learning, and now opening new fronts. What does this mean strategically in the immediate term? It means Russia faces a series of cascading choices, none of which restore the initiative. If Moscow pulls forces from the Eastern Front to contain Ukraine's new offensive, Ukrainian forces in the East can pressure Russian positions that are suddenly undermanned. If Moscow refuses to redeploy, Ukraine consolidates gains on the new front and uses it as a base for further operations. If Moscow attempts a general mobilization to generate more forces, it risks domestic unrest and economic collapse because Russian society is not on a war footing and cannot be put on one without triggering the kind of instability that topples governments. The economic dimension of this is crucial. Russia's war economy is running hot, but it is not sustainable indefinitely. Defense spending is crowding out civilian investment. Inflation is rising. Living standards are declining. The ruble is under pressure. International reserves are being depleted. At some point, the Russian state will face a choice between funding the war and funding the social programs that keep the population passive. That moment has not arrived yet, but it is approaching. And when it does, the political calculus changes. Leaders who promise strength and deliver economic pain do not stay in power forever. Let me now take you through the strategic consequences of this new front in concrete terms. Consequence number 1. Russia's ability to maintain offensive operations in the east is now compromised. Even if they stabilize the new front, the resources diverted to do so reduce their capacity to push forward elsewhere. The war, which Moscow hoped would shift decisively in their favor by summer 2026, is instead moving toward a frozen stalemate where both sides hold ground, but neither can force a breakthrough. That is a strategic defeat for Russia because time is not on their side. Western support for Ukraine is not collapsing. Sanctions are not being lifted. And every month that passes without Russian victory is another month where their economic and military position deteriorates. Consequence number 2, Ukraine has demonstrated to Western backers that it retains offensive capability and strategic initiative. This matters for future aid packages. Donor fatigue is real, but donor fatigue is mitigated when the recipient demonstrates competence, adaptability, and the ability to impose costs on the aggressor. Ukraine just proved it can do all three. Expect continued and possibly increased support from NATO members who see this as evidence that their investments are being used effectively. Consequence number 3, the credibility of Russian military power on the global stage has taken another blow. China is watching, India is watching, Middle Eastern states are watching, Central Asian republics are watching. What they are seeing is a Russian military that cannot quickly subdue a much smaller neighbor, that struggles with logistics and command, and that relies increasingly on mass artillery and attritional tactics rather than maneuver and decision. That image erodes Russia's ability to project power beyond its immediate borders and weakens its leverage in diplomatic negotiations elsewhere. Consequence number 4. This development increases pressure on Putin domestically. Russian state media can spin this however they like, but military families, regional governors, and security elites are seeing the reality. Wars that were supposed to be quick and victorious do not remain popular when they drag on and consume resources without delivering promised outcomes. Putin's political survival depends on maintaining the image of strength and control. Every scramble, every emergency redeployment, every visible sign of strategic confusion erodes that image incrementally. Now let us talk about scenarios. What happens next depends on choices made in Kyiv, Moscow, Washington, and Brussels over the next 60 to 90 days. Scenario 1. Russia manages to stabilize the new front by midsummer, regroups, and the war settles back into attritional stalemate with minor territorial adjustments. In this scenario, both sides dig in, casualties continue, and the conflict becomes a frozen war like Korea, Cyprus, or Nagorno-Karabakh before its recent flare-up. This is the most likely near-term outcome, but it is not stable long-term because frozen conflicts eventually thaw when one side gains a decisive advantage or internal pressures force a resolution. Scenario 2. Ukraine exploits Russian disarray to make significant territorial gains on the new front and uses that momentum to push in other areas, potentially threatening Russian positions in southern Ukraine or even Crimea by late 2026. This scenario requires sustained Western support, continued Ukrainian morale, and Russian inability to adapt effectively. It is less likely than scenario 1, but not implausible, especially if Russian logistics collapse in specific sectors or if Ukrainian forces achieve a breakthrough that cascades into wider disintegration of Russian defensive lines. Scenario 3, Russia escalates. This is the scenario everyone fears, but few want to articulate clearly. If Moscow perceives that it is losing strategically, if domestic pressure becomes unbearable, if Putin calculates that escalation is the only way to force a negotiated settlement favorable to Russia, then we enter dangerous territory. Escalation could mean intensified strikes on Ukrainian cities, attacks on Western supply routes, or in the worst case, use of tactical nuclear weapons to create a shock that freezes the conflict on Russian terms. This scenario is low probability but high consequence, and it is why Western capitals are managing support to Ukraine carefully, providing enough to prevent Russian victory, but not so much that Moscow feels existentially threatened. Scenario 4, negotiated settlement. At some point, both sides may conclude that continued fighting costs more than compromise. Ukraine might accept temporary loss of some territory in exchange for security guarantees and EU or NATO membership. Russia might accept less than total victory in exchange for sanctions relief and a face-saving narrative for domestic consumption. This scenario requires exhaustion on both sides and credible mediators willing to enforce agreements. We are not there yet, but if the war drags into 2027 with mounting costs and no decisive breakthrough, this becomes more plausible. But here is what you must understand about all 4 scenarios. None of them represent a return to the status quo ante. The world that existed before February 2022 is gone. European security architecture is permanently altered. Russia's relationship with the West is broken for a generation. NATO has been revitalized. Energy markets have been restructured. The global order has shifted. And Ukraine, whether it wins or loses this war, has proven itself as a nation in ways that will shape Eastern European geopolitics for the next 50 years. The opening of this new front is not just a tactical move in an ongoing war, it is a data point in a larger historical transformation. Let me close with the lesson that history teaches us about moments like this. When a larger power invades a smaller neighbor and expects quick submission and instead finds prolonged resistance, the invader faces a terrible choice: escalate to the point of total war with all its costs, or accept that the original objective is unattainable and find a way to withdraw without admitting defeat. Russia is now facing that choice. Now, the opening of this new front accelerates the timeline. Moscow can continue pouring resources into a conflict it cannot decisively win, hoping that Western support collapses or Ukrainian resolve breaks. Or it can begin the painful process of constructing an exit strategy that preserves some shred of domestic legitimacy. Neither option is attractive, but those are the only options that remain. What we are witnessing is not just the scramble of Russian troops to react to a new front. We are witnessing the slow-motion unraveling of a strategic gamble that was based on false assumptions about power, about resilience, and about how modern wars are fought and won. If you are serious about understanding these dynamics, if you want ongoing analysis that goes beyond headlines and shows you the structural logic underneath world events, subscribe now. And here is the question I want you to answer in the comments. Which scenario do you believe is most likely by the end of 2026? Stabilized stalemate, Ukrainian breakthrough, Russian escalation, or negotiated settlement? Your perspective matters. Share it below. And if you want to understand what comes next in this conflict, the next video will examine the one alliance shift that could change everything about how this war ends. Stay informed, stay clear, and never accept the surface narrative as the full story.